the city air that autumn was thick with the scent of rain-soaked leaves and ambition. On Culinary Row, where the glow of restaurant signs bled onto the wet cobblestones, a quiet war was brewing. At the heart of it stood Alara Vance, her hands dusted with flour, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from a pot of simmering broth. For her, cooking wasn't a job. It was a legacy, a penance, and the only language she truly understood. Her restaurant, The Hearth, was a sanctuary of classic cuisine. Its warm brick walls, exposed wooden beams, and the gentle clinking of silverware were a testament to tradition. It had been her father's dream, one that had crumbled under the weight of his own brilliance and reckless passion. Alara had spent the last 5 years painstakingly rebuilding it, not with his fiery innovation, but with her own quiet perfectionism. Every dish was a memory, every recipe a promise to never repeat his mistakes. Tonight, however, the familiar comfort of her kitchen felt fragile. Across the street, a supernova had just exploded. Vortex, the new restaurant by the infamous Julian Thorne, was having its grand opening. Lights flashed, music pulsed, and a crowd of the city's elite thronged its sleek minimalist entrance. Julian was everything Alara was not: a culinary rock star, a master of molecular gastronomy, a man who treated food like a science experiment and fame like an entitlement. His face, sharp angles, perpetually confident smirk, was plastered across every food magazine. "He's not a chef, he's a showman," Alara muttered, kneading a ball of dough with more force than necessary. Her best friend and pastry chef, Maya, leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone with a wicked grin. A showman who just got a 3-page spread in Cuisine Chronicle. They're calling his deconstructed bouillabaisse a paradigm shift. It's served in a vapor-filled orb. Ellie. "It's sacrilege," Alara retorted, her knuckles white. "Bouillabaisse is supposed to warm your soul, not fog up your glasses." "Well, his fog is stealing our reservations," Maya said, her tone softening. "Mrs. Gable just canceled her weekly booking. She wants to experience the future." Alara's shoulders slumped. Mrs. Gable had been coming every Tuesday since her father's time. It felt like a betrayal. The future is a fad. People always come back to what's real. "I hope you're right," Maya murmured, watching her friend's tense back. Later that night, after the last customer had left the hearth, Alara stepped out for a breath of fresh air. The party at Vortex was still raging. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Julian holding court, champagne flute in hand, effortlessly charming a circle of admirers. He was tall, dressed in a sharp black chef's coat that looked more like a designer jacket, his dark hair artfully tousled. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head. Their eyes locked across the street. The distance did nothing to dilute the arrogance in his look. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a slow, infuriating smirk spreading across his lips. It was a clear challenge. Game on. Alara's jaw tightened. She spun on her heel and marched back into the warmth of her empty restaurant. She wouldn't let him break her. She couldn't. Her father's ghost was in every corner, and she had a promise to keep. The war for Culinary Row had just begun, and Alara Vance was not going to surrender. The rivalry between the Hearth and Vortex quickly became the talk of the town. A clash of titans, a battle of philosophies played out on plates and in the press. Alara championed heritage, flavor, and soul. Julian preached innovation, texture, and surprise. Every morning, Alara would be at the farmer's market by sunrise, her fingers expertly testing the firmness of tomatoes and the freshness of herbs. She knew every vendor by name, her process a quiet, respectful ritual. And almost every morning, Julian would appear like a storm cloud, flanked by 2 assistants, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders for liquid nitrogen and yuzu flown in from Japan. "Morning, Vance," he'd call out, his voice laced with amusement. "Still playing with dirt and leaves, I see. Quaint." "At least my ingredients have character, Thorne," she'd shoot back, not looking up from a crate of mushrooms. "Unlike your lab-grown foam." Their staff felt the tension. A line cook from the Hearth defected to Vortex for a higher salary, an act Alara saw as a personal attack. In retaliation, when Julian's sommelier tried to secure an exclusive case of a rare vintage wine, she used her family's long-standing relationship with the vineyard to buy the entire stock first. Maya watched the escalating drama with the fascination of a spectator at a tennis match. "You know," she said one afternoon, piping delicate rosettes onto a cake, "for 2 people who claim to hate each other, you spend an awful lot of time thinking about one another." I'm thinking about how to crush his soulless culinary empire, Alara corrected, fiercely chopping onions, her eyes stinging for reasons that had nothing to do with the fumes. Right. Crushing, Maya said, licking a bit of frosting from her finger. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact he looks like he walked off the set of a cologne commercial and his voice has that low, gravelly thing going on. Maya. Alara's cheeks flushed. He's arrogant and insufferable. And you're obsessed, Maya finished with a giggle. It's kind of hot. Alara couldn't deny the obsession, but it wasn't attraction. It was fear. Julian represented everything that had destroyed her father, the pursuit of novelty over substance, the seduction of fame. She saw her father's reflection in Julian's confident smirk, and it terrified her. The battleground soon shifted to a more public arena. The city announced the annual Golden Ladle Festival, a week-long event culminating in a live cooking competition. The winner would not only receive a hefty cash prize, but also the kind of prestige that could cement a restaurant's reputation for years. It was the unofficial precursor to being considered for the coveted Ember Stars. The moment the announcement was made, an email landed in both Alara's and Julian's inboxes. They were being formally invited to compete as the festival's headliners. No, Alara said instantly, staring at the screen. It's a spectacle, a circus. A circus you need to be the ringmaster of, Maya argued, peering over her shoulder. Ellie, this is our chance to show the whole city what the hearth is about, to remind them that real food matters more than smoke and mirrors. Across the street, Julian was already on the phone with his PR team. I want a full media blitz. This isn't a competition, it's a coronation. One evening, as the city was hit by an unexpected blackout, the entire block was plunged into darkness. The frantic hum of generators from Vortex was the only sound. Alara's own generator had sputtered and died. Her walk-in freezers were beginning to thaw. Panic seized her. Thousands of dollars of prime ingredients, truffles, dry-aged beef, delicate seafood, were at risk. She was standing helplessly in her dark kitchen when a beam of light cut through the gloom. It was Julian, holding a heavy-duty flashlight. "Generator trouble, Vance?" he asked, his usual smirk absent. "What do you want, Thorne? To gloat?" He ignored her, his eyes scanning her kitchen. "You'll lose everything in those freezers within the hour. My generator has a spare output. We can run a power line across." Alara stared at him, stunned. "Why would you help me?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Because I want to beat you at the Golden Ladle on a level playing field. It's no fun competing against a chef who's gone bankrupt." He paused, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "And nobody should have to watch their life's work melt away." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and went to work. For the next hour, they worked in near silence, running thick cables across the wet street. His presence in her kitchen felt strange, invasive yet grounding. He moved with an unexpected efficiency, his hands, which she'd only seen creating delicate artistic plates, now capably handling industrial equipment. When the power from his generator finally hummed through her freezers, a wave of relief so profound washed over Alara that her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't mention it," he said, turning to leave. At the door, he stopped. "My father was a mechanic, taught me that some things are just worth fixing." He left before she could process the small, unguarded piece of himself he'd just offered. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. The image of Julian, his face illuminated by a flashlight, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, replayed in her mind. He was still her rival. He was still the man she was determined to beat. But for the first time, she wondered if there was more to Julian Thorne than the performance he showed the world. And that thought was far more dangerous than any deconstructed dish he could ever create. The week of the Golden Ladle Festival descended on the city like a fever. Tents bloomed in the central plaza. The air grew thick with the smells of 100 different cuisines, and the faces of Alara and Julian were everywhere. On posters, on morning talk shows, on the covers of local magazines. The narrative had been set, the classicist versus the futurist, tradition versus innovation, the hearth versus the vortex. The competition was structured in 3 rounds, each held on a different day. The first round was a technical skills challenge. Alara, with her years of classical training, executed a perfect seven-strand braided brioche and filleted a whole salmon with surgical precision. She moved with a quiet, focused grace. Julian, on the other hand, turned his station into a theater, using an anti-griddle to flash freeze olive oil into a delicate powder and spherifying melon juice into shimmering pearls. The crowd was dazzled. The judges were impressed by both. They ended the day in a dead heat. Backstage, they passed each other in a narrow hallway. "Nice parlor tricks, Thorne," Alara said, unable to resist. "Nice baking, Vance." "My grandmother would have been proud," he shot back, a familiar glint in his eye. But the animosity felt different now, less like a weapon and more like a well-worn habit. The second round was a mystery box challenge. Inside was a whole pig's head, monkfish liver, passion fruit, and blue cheese. It was a chef's nightmare. The crowd murmured as the contestants lifted their boxes. Alara's heart sank. These were aggressive, challenging ingredients, far more suited to Julian's experimental style. She saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes and steeled herself. While Julian immediately started breaking down the pig's head for a complex terrine, she took a deep breath, channeling her father's voice in her head. "Find the soul of the ingredient. Alara. Don't fight it." She rendered the fat from the jowl to pan-sear the monkfish liver, using the sharp passion fruit to cut through the richness and creating a savory sweet crumble with the blue cheese. It was risky, a departure from her usual comfort zone, but it was honest. As the clock ticked down, disaster struck. The induction burner at her station sputtered and died. A blue spark, then nothing. She frantically tried to reset it, but it was dead. Raw liver, half-rendered fat, and a cooling pan sat uselessly before her. 20 minutes left on the clock. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. This was it. A public failure. Just like her father, who had a legendary meltdown during a televised competition years ago, throwing a pan against the wall. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the burning sauce. It's happening again. The crowd's murmurs blurred into a roar in her ears. She felt her hands start to shake. "Judges, there's a technical issue at Chef Vance's station," the announcer boomed. A technician rushed over, fiddling with wires to no avail. "It's completely shot. We don't have a spare." Tears of frustration pricked Alara's eyes. It was over. She was going to be disqualified. She leaned against the counter, her face pale, the fight draining out of her. Then a voice cut through her despair. "She can use mine." Everyone turned. Julian Thorne had stopped working. He was wiping his hands on his apron, his expression unreadable. "My terrine is setting," he said, addressing the judges but looking at Alara. "My burner is free. Let her finish." The crowd gasped. The judges exchanged stunned looks. It was an unprecedented act of sportsmanship. "Mr. Thorne, that's highly irregular," one of the judges began. "It's more irregular to have faulty equipment and the competition," Julian countered smoothly. "Unless the golden ladle is a test of engineering, not cooking. I came here to compete against the best. Let her prove she is." His words hung in the air, a challenge to the judges and a lifeline to her. Alara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was giving her a chance, sacrificing his own time, risking a penalty for her. The head judge finally nodded. "Very well. Chef Vance, move to Chef Thorne's station." In a daze, Alara grabbed her pan and ingredients and rushed over. The space was shockingly organized, a stark contrast to her own controlled chaos. She placed her pan on his burner, and the steady blue flame roared to life. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her. He didn't speak, just gave her a short, sharp nod. "Go on." With renewed fire, Alara finished her dish with seconds to spare. Her hands were steady now. As she placed the final garnish, her eyes met Julian's over the pass. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of intense, unnerving respect. When she presented her dish, her voice was clear and strong. Pan-seared monkfish liver with passion fruit gastrique and a blue cheese crumble. The judges were blown away. The combination was daring, the execution flawless. When Julian presented his intricate head cheese terrine, it was equally praised for its technical brilliance. At the end of the day, the scores were announced. Alara had pulled ahead by a single razor-thin point. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. She had won the round, but everyone knew who the real story was. As they walked off stage, away from the cameras and the crowd, Alara caught up to him. "Julian." He stopped, but didn't turn around. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. He finally faced her. The stage lights cast shadows under his sharp cheekbones. Because I know what it's like to have everything on the line, only to be failed by something you can't control. His gaze was direct, stripped of all artifice. I told you. I want to beat you, but I want to do it fair and square. Now you owe me a real fight in the finale. He walked away, leaving her standing in the wings, the roar of the crowd fading into the background. She had won the battle, but something felt irrevocably lost, or perhaps found. The carefully constructed wall between them, built of animosity and professional pride, had just been smashed to pieces by an act of unexpected grace. And Alara had a terrifying feeling that the final round of the competition was no longer about the food. The final day of the Golden Ladle Festival was electric. The theme for the finale was a three-course meal that represented the chef's personal journey. It was a challenge of storytelling as much as skill. Backstage, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. The rivalry was still there, but it was now underscored by a fragile, unspoken understanding. Alara had spent a sleepless night planning her menu. It was a tribute to her father, but with a twist. The first course was a delicate scallop crudo, representing the raw talent he was born with. The main was a slow-braised short rib, symbolizing the years of hard work and the comforting foundation of his cooking. For dessert, she would make his favorite, a classic apple tart tatin, but she would serve it with a salted caramel ice cream, her own addition, her own voice. It was a story of legacy and evolution. Julian's station was a whirl of quiet, intense activity. He remained tight-lipped about his menu, but the equipment he'd laid out, a sous vide machine, a smoke gun, a cream whipper charged with nitrous oxide, spoke volumes. It would be audacious. The competition began. For 3 hours, they worked in a seamless, focused ballet. Alara felt a strange sense of calm. The panic from the day before was gone, replaced by a clear-headed purpose. Across the aisle, she could feel Julian's presence, not as a threat, but as a silent benchmark pushing her to be better. As the final minutes ticked away, Alara was caramelizing the apples for her tarte tatin. The smell of butter and sugar filled the air. It was the scent of her childhood. She slid the pan into the oven, her heart swelling with a mix of grief and pride. "This is for you, Dad." The presentations were a study in contrasts. Julian's meal was a masterpiece of technique and autobiography. His first course, called Concrete Garden, featured root vegetables cooked to look like pebbles served on an edible dirt of black olives and rye, a nod to his gritty urban upbringing. His main, the Ascent, was a perfectly cooked piece of Wagyu beef suspended over an aromatic smoke, representing his climb to the top. His dessert, Shattered, was a sugar dome that diners had to break with a small spoon to reveal a bitter chocolate mousse inside, symbolizing the barriers he'd had to break. It was brilliant, personal, and devastatingly effective. Then, it was Alara's turn. She presented her dishes with a simple, heartfelt narrative. She spoke of her father's passion, his fall, and her promise to honor his legacy while forging her own path. When she served the tarte tatin, she looked directly at the head judge, Genevieve Croft, a notoriously tough critic. "The tart was his," Alara said, her voice steady. "The salt in the caramel, that's mine." The judges tasted, deliberated, and their faces were impossible to read. The silence in the plaza stretched into an eternity. Alara stood beside Julian, their shoulders almost touching, both of them staring straight ahead, breathing in sync. Genevieve Croft finally stood up, microphone in hand. "In my 30 years as a critic," she began, her voice resonating through the speakers, "I have rarely seen a competition of this caliber. We have witnessed two masters at the peak of their craft." She paused, looking from Julian to Alara. "Chef Thorne, your meal was a work of genius. A breathtaking display of artistry and ambition. You cook with your mind, and it is a formidable one." Julian gave a slight nod, his jaw tight. "Chef Vance," Genevieve continued, turning to Alara, "your meal was a work of profound emotion. You cook with your heart, and you have reminded us all that food, at its core, is about memory and love." Alara felt her eyes well up. "There can only be one winner of the Golden Ladle," Genevieve said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "But today, we feel that would be an injustice. For the first time in the festival's history, the judges have declared a tie." The crowd erupted. A chaotic, joyful roar filled the plaza. Alara's knees went weak with relief. A tie. She hadn't lost, but she hadn't won either. Confetti cannons exploded, showering them in gold. In the whirlwind of noise and flashing lights, Alara turned to Julian. He was already looking at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It wasn't his usual smirk. This one was genuine, unguarded, and it reached his eyes. A tie, Vance, he said over the noise, leaning closer. Can't say I'm surprised. How could they possibly choose between the past and the future? Maybe, she yelled back, a laugh bubbling up inside her. They realized you need a little of both. He laughed, a real, deep laugh that she had never heard before. Before she could react, he closed the small distance between them and wrapped his arms around her in a hug. It was brief, unexpected, and utterly overwhelming. For a moment, buried in the scent of smoke, spices, and something that was uniquely him, the world fell away. There was no competition, no rivalry, just two people who had pushed each other to the brink and found something surprising on the other side. When he pulled back, the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Congratulations, Alara, he said, using her first name for the first time. You too, Julian, she whispered back. The trophy was a large golden ladle, comically oversized. The organizers insisted they hold it together for the photos. As they stood side by side, their hands brushing on the cool metal, Alara knew that even though the competition was over, this, whatever this was, had only just begun. Later that evening, after the endless interviews and congratulations, Alara escaped to the quiet rooftop of a nearby hotel, which hosted the after-party. Below, the festival lights still twinkled, but up here, there was only the cool night air and the distant hum of the city. She needed a moment to breathe, to process the impossible day. The tie felt like a strange kind of victory. It validated her path without diminishing his. It was fair, and she had Julian to thank for it. If he hadn't helped her yesterday, she wouldn't even be here. The door to the rooftop creaked open, and he stepped out, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He walked over and handed one to her, their fingers brushing. Hiding from your adoring fans, Vance? He asked, his voice softer now. Something like that, she admitted, taking a sip. You? I've had enough performance for one day. He leaned against the railing beside her, staring out at the city skyline. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment. My father, Julian said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, spent his whole life fixing other people's cars, but never owned one that wasn't on the verge of breaking down. He always said, son, don't ever let anyone look at you and see cheap. I've spent my whole career trying to build things so new, so shiny, so expensive that no one could ever mistake me for that greasy kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Alara turned to look at him. In the dim light, she saw the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden. The arrogance, the showmanship, it was all armor. My dad was the opposite, she found herself saying, her voice quiet. He was a culinary genius. Everyone said so. But he chased every new trend, took every risk, and mortgaged the restaurant, our house, everything, on ideas that were brilliant but unsustainable. He flew too close to the sun. When he lost it all, he just gave up. I've spent my life terrified of taking risks. Sticking to the classics felt safe. It felt like the only way I wouldn't end up like him. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. So you cook from a place of fear, and you cook from a place of pride, she countered gently. Maybe we're 2 sides of the same coin, he murmured, taking a small step closer. The space between them crackled. All the witty retorts, the professional jabs, the years of carefully maintained distance evaporated into the night air. Julian, she whispered, her heart starting a frantic rhythm. You know, he said, his voice a low thrum, for months, I told myself that the reason I couldn't stop thinking about you was because you were my competition, that I was just studying my enemy. Me too, she confessed, her voice barely audible. I was lying to myself, he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. I wasn't studying you. I was mesmerized by you. By your passion, your stubbornness, your insane dedication to a goddamn perfect piece of brioche. A shaky laugh escaped her. I thought you were the most arrogant, insufferable man I had ever met. And, he prompted, a ghost of his old smirk playing on his lips. And I think I was half right, she said, her own lips curving into a smile. But the other half, the half that stopped a competition for his rival, the half that knows how to fix a generator, I think I could get used to that half. He closed the remaining distance between them. His hand came up to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. Alara, he breathed, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of triumph or possession. It was a kiss of questions and answers, of relief and discovery. It was gentle at first, then deepened as years of pent-up tension and unspoken fascination finally found their release. Her hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his chef's coat. It was a kiss that tasted of champagne, cool night air, and the electrifying possibility of a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "So," he whispered, a smile in his voice, "does this mean you'll finally admit my liquid nitrogen foam is brilliant?" Alara laughed, a real, unburdened sound. "Don't push it, Thorn." But she didn't pull away. Under the vast, star-dusted sky, surrounded by the city they both longed to conquer, the rivals had finally called a truce. And in the silent, shimmering space between them, they had found something far more valuable than any golden ladle. News of the golden ladle tie spread through the culinary world like wildfire. Alara and Julian were no longer just local rivals. They were a national story. A feature in Cuisine Chronicle dubbed them the unlikely duo, praising their yin and yang approach to food. The article was accompanied by a photo of them holding the trophy together, an image that captured their lingering tension and a new, undeniable chemistry. Back on Culinary Row, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The staff at the Hearth and Vortex watched their bosses with a mixture of confusion and amusement. The morning sparring matches at the farmer's market were replaced by quiet conversations over coffee. Sometimes, Julian would bring over a new experimental component, a basil-infused oil that tasted like summer, a sphere of balsamic vinegar that burst in your mouth, and ask for Alara's opinion. "It needs more salt," she'd say, ever the pragmatist. "It's not about the salt, it's about the experience," he'd argue, but there was no heat in it. Instead of walking away, he'd listen. In return, she found herself showing him techniques from her father's old notebooks, methods for extracting a depth of flavor from simple ingredients that no modern machine could replicate. He watched, fascinated, absorbing her knowledge with an intensity that surprised her. Their relationship unfolded in stolen moments. A late-night walk after their restaurants had closed, their footsteps echoing on the empty cobblestones. A shared bottle of wine in the back office of the Hearth, surrounded by the comforting smell of yeast and old wood. They talked for hours, not as rivals, but as two people who finally felt understood. He told her about the crushing pressure to stay on top, the constant fear that one misstep would send him back to the poverty he'd fought so hard to escape. She told him about the loneliness of upholding her father's legacy, the burden of being the responsible one, the secret desire she sometimes had to just burn it all down and walk away. Maya, of course, was ecstatic. "I knew it," she shrieked one day, finding a single, perfect, jewel-like raspberry macaron on Alara's desk, a clear product of Julian's kitchen. "My soap opera is finally getting to the good part. When do you start making out on the prep tables?" "Maya, we're just talking," Alara said, her face flushing as she carefully tucked the macaron away to savor later. Talking," Maya said, wiggling her eyebrows. "Is that what the kids are calling it these days?" The notes started soon after, not on paper, but in food. One morning, a small unlabeled box would appear at her back door. Inside would be an ingredient he knew she was looking for, a rare white truffle, a perfectly marbled cut of beef. There was never a message, but she knew it was from him. In return, a container of her rich, healing chicken broth would find its way to his kitchen on a day she knew he was exhausted. It was their own secret language. One evening, he found her in her father's old office, staring at a wall of faded photographs and accolades. Her shoulders were slumped with the weight of it all. He didn't say anything, just came and stood behind her, his hands gently landing on her shoulders, kneading the tense muscles. "You're carrying a lot for one person, Alara." She leaned back into his touch, a sigh escaping her. "It's all I know how to do." "Maybe you don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said softly. The words hung in the air, a quiet promise that made her heart ache with a hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. Their collaboration became official when a major charity asked them to co-host a fundraising gala. The theme was Past Meets Future. The press went wild. The idea of the two most talked about chefs in the country creating a menu together was a ticket that sold out in hours. Planning the gala was a dance of compromise and discovery. We can't serve a consommé as a clear gel, Elara insisted, looking at his proposal. It's unnatural. It's thought-provoking, Julian countered. It challenges the diner's perception. Or it just makes them feel like they're eating a jellyfish. They argued for an hour, but in the end, they found a middle ground. A classic, crystal-clear consommé poured tableside over a delicate brunoise of vegetables that had been cryo-blanched for a perfect, crisp texture. It was her soul, his technique. It was them on a plate. The night of the gala was a resounding success. In the kitchen, they moved around each other with an effortless synchronicity, a team in every sense of the word. At the end of the night, as the applause echoed through the dining hall, they stood together in the kitchen doorway, watching the happy, satisfied guests. "We did it," Elara said, a tired but brilliant smile on her face. "Of course we did," Julian said, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her close. "We're better together." He leaned down and kissed her, right there in the hustle of the post-service kitchen. The clatter of pans and the shouting of orders faded into a distant buzz. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a declaration. The staff who saw it just smiled. It was about time. 6 months after the gala, the nominations for the prestigious Ember Stars were announced. Both the Hearth and Vortex were on the list. The old anxiety would have sent Elara into a spiral of sleepless nights. The old arrogance would have had Julian planning his victory speech. But now, things were different. They waited for the results together, sitting on the counter of Elara's closed kitchen, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese. "Are you nervous?" she asked, nudging his foot with hers. "Terrified," he admitted with a wry smile. "But it doesn't feel like the end of the world anymore. Whether I get a star or not, I still get to come across the street and steal your bread." "Hey, you don't steal it, I give it to you," she laughed. The email arrived just after midnight. Elara's hands trembled as she opened it on her phone. She read it and her breath hitched. She handed the phone to Julian. He read it and a slow, wide grin spread across his face. He looked at her, his eyes shining. "1 star," he said softly, "for the Hearth." A tear slipped down Elara's cheek, one of pure, unadulterated joy. She had done it. She had honored her father's legacy and saved his dream. "What about you?" she asked, her voice thick. He pulled out his own phone, opened his email, and then he laughed. 1 star for Vortex. They had both won, separately but together. She threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off the counter, spinning her around in the quiet, flour-dusted kitchen. The ghosts of the past were finally at peace. "You know," he said, setting her down but keeping her close, "they called us a duo, but I was thinking of a different word." "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" she asked, her hands linked behind his neck. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elara's heart stopped. "Partners," he whispered, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "For life. What do you say, Vance? Ready to merge the past and the future for good?" Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was laughing. "Are you proposing in my kitchen, Thorn?" "I fell in love with you in this kitchen," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I saw you fight for it, protect it. I saw your heart in every dish. There's no other place I would ask." "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, you arrogant, insufferable, wonderful man. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. And he kissed her, a deep, promising kiss that spoke of shared sunrises at the market, of late nights in the kitchen, of arguments and truces, and of a love that was forged in fire, seasoned with rivalry, and served with a side of happily ever after. The next morning, 2 signs appeared in the windows of the restaurants on Culinary Row. One in the warm, traditional script of the Hearth, and one in the sleek, modern font of Vortex. They both said the same thing. Closed for a private event. We're getting married. And the city, which had followed their story with bated breath, finally got the ending it had been rooting for all along.